waiting in the morning light. Suyu Shao's sat by the lakeside inn, a small cottage. Every morning she would look out at the sparkling lake. As the sunlight touched the surface, creating ripples that seemed to converse with the sky, the distant mountains, which had always been her backdrop, still stood firm, an eternal part of her life. She loved the scenery here, once shared with him. Now it remained her solitary watch. Every morning, Suyu would stand by the window, gazing at the view. There was a vague emptiness she could never quite put into words. The lavender flowers on the windowsill, which she had planted herself, swayed gently in the light breeze, releasing a fragrance that filled the room. Every time her eyes lingered on the flowers, she couldn't help but recall his words. These flowers will bloom beautifully, just like our future. Back then, she had never thought too much about it. She only knew that his warm words were like sunlight that shone on her heart, bringing her comfort. But now, after all this time, he had left for over a year, and she was left alone to face this place they once shared. She could still remember the day he left. The sun was bright, and the light bathed the room in a warm glow. He looked at her with a soft, almost reluctant gaze, but there was an underlying determination in his eyes. Without much explanation, he simply said, "I'll be back." Then he left as though something urgent called him away. That day, the lake outside shimmered red in the sunlight, and everything seemed calm yet deep inside. A wave of uncertainty surged within her. "I'll be back," he had said in a soft yet firm voice. Back then, Suyu didn't think much of it. She believed he would return. After all, he had never lied to her. But as the days passed, and then the weeks, the months, that belief started to waver. She realized that he might not be coming back after all. In the beginning, Suyu didn't question him. She went on with her work, living the life she knew, as if he had just temporarily left. But as the days turned into weeks, then months, Suyu began to realize that he had truly disappeared from her life. At first, Suyu didn't let it worry her. She kept busy with her routine, trying not to overthink it. But then, after 1 month, 2 months, and then 3, she began to feel an unsettling emptiness. Every day she woke up, the space beside her was empty. The bed was unmade. The kitchen lacked his presence, and she realized she hadn't heard from him in a long time. Maybe it should wait a little longer, Suyu tried to tell herself. But as time went on, the weight of loneliness began to settle in, and the absence of his messages began to feel like a cold void. Her mind drifted in a spiral of doubt, until one day, she started to question whether he would return at all. Maybe he had found a new life. Maybe he had forgotten her. So she turned inward. She started painting again, trying to fill the emptiness that he had left behind. She painted the lake, the mountains, and the horizon, the same images they had once talked about. But she also began painting her own feelings, pouring her solitude, her grief, and her faint hope into each stroke of the brush. Every morning she still stood by the window, gazing out at the same view. She watched the lake ripple, saw the distant mountains, bathed in the early light, and felt a quiet longing stir within her. She told herself, perhaps he was out there somewhere, standing by a lake, gazing at the same mountains and thinking of her, just as she thought of him. And then came the day when Suyu made a decision. She would leave. She packed her bags, determined to find a new beginning, away from the lake, away from the memories. But as she stood at the window, ready to leave the familiar landscape of the lake and mountains, seemed to silently watch her. She stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath, preparing herself to move on. Just as she was about to leave, she heard a gentle knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, her hands trembled. She almost didn't believe her ears. She walked toward the door, took a deep breath and opened it. The moment the door creaked open, she stood frozen. There, standing in front of her, was the one person she had been waiting for, his face warm but still familiar, his eyes filled with warmth and the same gentleness. She remembered it was him, just as he had promised. I'm back," he said softly, his voice carrying a deep sense of apology and regret. Suyu stood still, her heart racing, her eyes filling with tears. She said nothing, just gazed at him. It felt as if all the waiting, all the uncertainty, had finally led to this moment. "Where have you been?" she asked quietly, her voice catching in her throat. "Why didn't you contact me? I thought you..." He sighed deeply, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the silence between them. "I'm sorry. I couldn't face you. There were things I needed to handle, important things. I've been trying to fix it, but I couldn't train myself to contact you. I was afraid you'd worry, so I stayed silent." Suyu's shirt was a mix of confusion and emotion. She didn't know what to say. The strength and independence she had built over the past months seemed to fade in that moment. She lowered her head, wiping away the tears that had fallen silently. She smiled faintly, her voice soft but steady. "I know, you've had your reasons. I was afraid that without you, I'd lose myself." He gently reached out and touched her hair, his voice tender. I'm sorry. I know you've been through a lot, and maybe I'll never fully understand your pain, but I'm here now, and it will make up for the time I've lost." They sat together, talking through the past year, the things they had missed, the silent spaces between them. Suyu told him how, during his absence, she had learned to be independent, how she had found strength in solitude, and how the loneliness had taught her to heal herself. It had been painful, but it had also given her clarity about what she truly needed. He listened to her, his eyes full of regret, but also gratitude. I'm proud of you. You've grown stronger than I could have imagined. I thought I was the one protecting you, but you've carried yourself through all of this." Suyu shook her head and smiled softly. "We all grow, don't we? Through the pain, through the waiting. I've found myself again, and now I know true happiness isn't about depending on others, it's about depending on yourself."